Hi, I'm Bernie Hynes. I'm head of research with the LGMA and also co-author of a report that we published earlier in the year called A Profile of Local Government Climate Actions in Ireland. The research took place in 2019 with most of the data gathered in the first two quarters of 2019. Now, a lot has moved on since then, but the research was critical in capturing a snapshot of what local authorities were doing in relation to climate action and climate change at that time, and highlighting the leadership role that many local authorities had assumed locally. Now, local authorities were working, so they do operate in quite a complex environment. Their business, as usual, is where they're responsible for delivering between 600 and 1,000 different services. And they are grant funded by almost 30 different government departments and state agencies. Many of which, similar to the local authorities, were finding that climate action, climate change were moving up their policy agendas in terms of priority. So we really have quite a pretty complicated policy and operational landscape that local authorities were operating in. And at that point, we were asked then to come in and try and capture a baseline of activity relating to climate action across the sector. So the challenge for us then was to document and quantify the level and scope of activity in the sector at the time. And this was in order to give some visibility to the range and variety of actions taking place across the sector. But it was also hoped then that the study could act as a benchmark against future developments so we could track what kind of progress we were making. Now, we selected two data collection tools. The first was the questionnaire. Now, this allowed us to gather quite an extensive amount of data across a wide range of topics, but it didn't really allow us to go into too much detail under any of these. So we supplemented that then with a range of case studies, and these were the tools through which we were able to provide the detailed insight into what a lot of the climate action, the actions actually look like on the ground. So we worked closely with the National Local Authority Climate Change Steering Group and with the CCMA Environment, Climate Change and Emergency Response Committees. They were really responsible, I suppose, for the governance of the work. Now, we worked very directly then with the staff in the four CAROs to develop the survey, the themes and the questions. And they were instrumental in facilitating the administration of the questionnaire and the data collection. Now, the themes that you see listed there on the screen, the 7 themes under the thematic area, they were developed after consultation with a variety of policy documents. But we're not going to deal with the top 3 there today because they were really looking at what structures need to be in place to complete the local authority adaptation strategies. And as they're all done, we're going to just focus today on the 4 themes below that are highlighted there in green. So overall, we had a 100% response rate, but as can be expected in when you're dealing with a survey that's this detailed, that had 119 questions in it, many of which were open-ended. There was a response to all, but they may not have all been completed to the same level of detail. But overall, the quality and quantity of responses was actually very, very high. So we also then gathered a range of case studies, and as you can see there were 44 case studies that were gathered. Now, the bulk of the questions and the bulk of the case studies relate to the 4 topics that we're actually going to cover today. So I'm going to move on now to look at the findings, and we'll start then with the busiest of the 4 themes, which is critical infrastructure. So there were a lot of areas covered under this theme, so I'm going to progress quickly through each and identify what the key findings were in terms of quantifying and identifying relevant case studies under each of the topics. So if we start off there by looking at energy efficiency, we'll see that under this theme, really reducing energy consumption is the priority at a national level and also at a local level. So the main activities that were identified at the time of the survey related to prioritising retrofits and energy projects. One of the key areas that we looked at in the survey was to identify whether there were structures in place to manage and monitor the energy theme. And what the results showed is that 30 of the local authorities at that point reported that they did have energy management teams in place. And a further 26 then had identified that they actually had energy master plans in place. And there were actually 3 case studies then that emerged under this theme from Waterford, South Dublin, and from Louth. Now, if we go on then and look at the next area we looked at under this, it's around the regional and county level energy agencies. Now, we looked at this because the research did show that engagement with the energy agencies provided support and enhanced the work of local authorities. So in the survey, 17 of the local authorities were mapped against 8 energy agencies that we have nationally. And some of the outcomes really included, like some of the research carried out by one agency in particular, 3CEA, in 2018. It was able to report on findings from 20 local authorities who completed a survey, and it shows that there had been an investment of 120 million in climate-related investment activities between 2011 and 2017. And that this translated into savings, the equivalent of 61,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions, or 11,000 houses annually. We also it was also reported back that in the case of 16 local authorities, that the SEAI had at that time expected 33% of those to exceed their targets. And the survey also identified that 14 local authorities were signatories with the Covenant of Mayors, and that 13 of them had at that point ISO accreditation. And there was a case study that was quite interesting in relation to district heating from South Dublin at that point. But these 3 case studies were also included on the theme that are quite interesting. So the first you see there was carried out by Galway City Council in 2010-2011. Now, each of the local authorities, they do look at the energy bills to identify areas that are where there's most energy consumption. And leisure centres, because they require heating large volumes of heated water, are frequently to the top of the list. So the leisure centre accounted in Galway accounted for 19% of their energy bill at the time. So at that time they switched from oil to gas to make energy savings. Now, if we move on to look at Castlebar, you can see many years later, a similar initiative was undertaken. But what we see here is that savings were gained from a switch from non-sustainable to sustainable and renewable energy sources. So you see things have moved on even in that space of time. And then the third case study there relates to Dublin City Council. And here we see, I suppose, levels of innovation emerging where Dublin engaged with a third party to try and share the risk and the potential savings across 10 leisure centres. So they entered these kind of contractual agreements where the third party would assume responsibility for certain levels of investment and in return receive some of the savings that were realised. So if we move on now to look at the public lighting. Now, this is the key initiative to reaching our 2030 energy reduction targets, because it is one of the largest consumptions of energy that we have. So all local authorities are currently involved in replacing all non-LED bulbs with LED bulbs. So they've also, it was revealed in the study at that time, we had already mandated that all new projects use LED, and they were also starting to pilot smart lighting projects. We saw that 24 of them reported being involved in a national project. Now, while every local authority was involved in lighting projects themselves, there were 24 that came together to form a national project. And that project then was able to quantify its investment and its expected savings. So it had documented that there was going to be an investment of 151 million that would result in the savings of 31,000 tonnes of CO2 per annum, which is the equivalent of energy for 5,600 houses annually. When we move on now to look at renewable energies, we're talking here now about solar, wind and wave. So local authorities obviously have a role to play in relation to planning as they assess the various applications. But the survey actually looked to try and quantify the number of local authorities both receiving and grant funding activities in the area. And the survey revealed that almost all local authorities were involved in this activity. In addition, 20 of them had reported that they were piloting NZEBs in relation to social housing. So this is where buildings have to have an energy rating of A2 or higher. There are various case studies under this heading, and Tipperary, Roscommon and Carlow, Wicklow all had case studies relating to solar PV panels. Wexford had given an example there of a group water scheme it was working with, and Kerry had an example of the waste to energy landfill. So this was a landfill where gas was used to generate electricity. But there were also case studies coming in from Dublin in relation to social housing, and they gave an example where 8,000 units had been upgraded in 2013, and they were able to estimate that they'd made savings of just under 30 million on energy bills. A similar example in Sligo, where 50% energy savings for residents were recorded after a regeneration project. Now, the next topic then looks at local authority vehicle fleets. And here what we see is that at the time of the survey, 18 local authorities had electric vehicle or hybrids as part of their fleet, and 29 had reported a total of 260 charging points, and 24 had electric vehicle parking spaces. In relation to case studies, there was a case study provided by Dún Laoghaire in relation to their electric vehicle fleet. Now, when looking at planning in the public realm, the key objective here was to promote the transition to climate-friendly modes of transport. When we developed the survey, the objective was to look at not just what local authorities were doing for the citizens, but what they were taking responsibility for themselves. And the survey reveals that 26 of the local authorities had actually walking and cycling strategies in place, and 25 had engaged in smarter travel initiatives for their own staff. In addition, then, they had reported 14,000 public bicycle parking spaces and 1,600 kilometres of integrated and 1,500 kilometres of segregated cycle lanes at that time. Now, there are a variety of case studies also under this heading. Obviously, the Dublin Bikes being key one, but there's the Leitrim Smarter Travel Programme, and also Offaly had a case study that detailed how they tackled issues related to cracking roads built over bogland. And the final case study under this topic related to Portlaoise and its transition to a low carbon town. We're going to look now at the final topic under this heading, which relates to waste management. And the survey looked at initiatives focusing on local authority management of their own waste, as well as initiatives aimed at the public. So the survey revealed that 28 local authorities had reported that they had internal waste management systems in place, and 19 of them were actively monitoring their waste generation so that they could track whether they were actually making any progress in relation to reductions. The survey reported that in total at that point there were 900 bring centres and civic amenity sites in place. Also 28 of the local authorities had participated in initiatives in relation to food waste, and over the period of 2017 and 2018, 600 plus anti-dumping and littering initiatives had been driven by the local authority. And the case study then under this heading relates to mywaste.ie. Now, water and flood risk management are the second of the four topics that we're going to look at today. Now, while there are many weather-related risks in Ireland, flooding does remain the primary risk for us nationally. So this section will focus in on floods and water management, and you'll see 5 distinct topics listed there. And then we have 7 case studies that will appear under this heading. Now, looking at flood risk management, local authorities need to assess planning applications in relation to flood risk for all applications, But 18 of the local authorities in the survey had actually reported that they'd put full-time staff in place just to look specifically at this issue because it was such a considerable issue for them. Now, in addition, local authorities have strategic flood risk assessments. Now, at the time of the survey, 31 of them had them in place for their city and county development plans. Now, these are assessments that detail all the local flood risks in the area, and they were also in place for almost all the local area plans. The survey captured information in relation to 10 strategic development zones, and the survey revealed that 8 of those had SFRAs in place. Now, moving on to look at responding to weather events, the framework for major emergency management identifies the local authorities as the lead state body at a local and regional level with responsibility for preparing for and responding to flood risk and major weather events. Now, when we conducted the survey, the local authorities reported that 21 of them had activated the response plans on 82 occasions between 2014 and 2018. Now, not all local authorities recorded the costs, but of those that did, it was reported that over 100 million was spent during the same period dealing with the consequences of the weather. Now, the case studies under this topic relate to Inishowen and flood damage after a very extreme pluvial rainfall event. County Clare then, it was a rock armour wall that was put in place to combat coastal erosion. And Cavan provided a case study that was about tracking the financial cost of major weather events. Looking at the area of flood defences, this is an area where traditionally a structural or an engineering approach to flood protection measures were put in place, but there has been a move to more proactive, sustainable approaches that rely on non-structural, nature-based solutions to address floods and coastal erosion. So overall, there's a more sustainable approach with the local authorities working very closely with the OPW in this area. If we look to the survey then, one of the things we looked at was to see whether there were sustainable urban drainage systems in place across local authorities, and 30 local authorities had identified that they were actually included in their development plans. 9 local authorities had identified that they were currently at that point using wetlands for flood control or water quality improvement purposes. 24 had surface water management plans in place, and 14 local authorities had 21 flood defence projects in progress or completed. But overall, there were 228 OPW flood and coastal protection schemes that had been delivered or were work in progress, and the investment at that point was 173 million. Now, in terms of case studies under this topic, there was a case study from Offaly that looked at a clay embankment to protect a housing estate from flooding. Dublin City was looking at the management of surface water runoffs. Cork was looking at beach coastal erosion, and Athlone was looking at a flood defence scheme. Now we move on then to look at water conservation management. Now the focus here is on the local authority efforts to conserve and promote water conservation. The results from this were that there were water usage measurement schemes in place in 19 of the local authorities. And when they were putting initiatives in place, it was really around water efficiency appliances. So I suppose it was a lot of fitting and retrofitting water efficient appliances in their own buildings and then in social housing and in social housing. And then there were also 15 local authorities that were involved in promoting water conservation initiatives. And the last area that we look at under this theme relates to bathing water and water quality. So this is an area where there's been an increased demand as population grows and as there's increased urbanisation. And that's particularly true, I suppose, at this current time during the pandemic. Demands on services, coastal services, bathing and so on have increased quite dramatically. In 2019, it was reported by the EPA, who monitor water quality, that 94% of bathing water at that time met the minimum standard, with 71% being excellent and 15% being good. There's also an increased focus in identifying the issue under the adaptation plans. So in particular, just say services like lifeguards, there's an increased emphasis on them, but there's also an extension of their role in terms of new issues they need to deal with, such as beach closures as a consequence of flooding. So it is an area that has gained a lot of increased attention in the past, but continues to do so. Now, the third of the three areas that we're going to look at is the nature-based solutions. So while nature-based solutions have already been identified as a key to adapting to and mitigating against flooding, there's an increasing understanding that the current threat to our biodiversity can also be addressed through nature-based solutions. There are 9 headings under this topic and 7. The first subcategory under this theme relates to biodiversity and the environment. So when we were looking at this area, we asked local authorities whether they had biodiversity action plans in place, and 29 of them had. And in addition, there were 17 that identified specific actions relating to climate change in those plans. 28 identified that they had biodiversity officers in place. So the biodiversity officers, along with the heritage officers, were heavily involved in community engagement and community involvement, and key in terms of trying to elicit some of the behavioural changes that are needed at a societal level. And the case study in this instance then related to Longford's pollinator-friendly garden. The next subtopic then relates to landscape classification assessments. Now, these take into account each area's sensitivities and key characteristics that distinguish their landscape. And these are used then to support development of appropriate environmental policies. Now, 29 of the county and city development plans had named them as a necessity. And at the time of the survey, 27 local authorities had them in place. We move on then to look at the invasive alien species. So the spread, I suppose, of the invasive alien species may in some part be due to increasing temperatures. Now, the subject is addressed as part of the biodiversity plans, but 19 local authorities had specific plans identified to focus specifically on the topic. And in terms of case studies, Galway have a case study that addresses the issue of giant rhubarb in their area, while Limerick looks at how to eradicate the giant hogweed. Moving on then to look at tree management. What we see, I suppose, is the major collaborator with local authorities in this area is the Tree Council of Ireland. The survey looked at whether there were tree management plans in place, and 12 local authorities identified that they had tree management plans in place, and then in addition there were urban woodland strategies in place in 6 of the local authorities. Now, not all local authorities recorded whether they were planting trees or not, but of the 23 that were able to give us information, it was reported that between 2017 and 2018 there were in excess of 70,000 trees that. Now, looking at the topic of green infrastructure, this is defined in the report as the interconnected network of green space that preserves natural ecosystems. Now, what we looked for in the survey was whether there were green infrastructure strategies or guidelines in place. And 19 local authorities identified that that was actually the case. Now, this illustrates for these local authorities a particular commitment to quite a structured approach to managing the green infrastructure. The next area we look at relates to public open parks and spaces. Now, this is an area where local authorities have always been traditionally heavily involved with, but in the report we asked the local authorities whether they have specific strategies in place for the management of these spaces, and 11 local authorities reported that they had. This is probably driven in large part by the increased utilisation of parks and the demand for open spaces, and particularly as population increases and there's increased urbanisation. In terms of the case studies under this topic, Fingal provide an interesting case study in relation to Malahide Domain, and the particular photograph there that's included, it relates to their tropical butterfly home. South Dublin, the focus in their case study relates to the development of meadowlands, while Cork City have a case study there that looks at a landfill that was converted to a public park. Now, while looking at the area of the pesticide and herbicide use, the overall objective really is to reduce the use of pesticides and herbicides because of a decline in the insect and invertebrate populations and because of potential of watercourse pollution. Now, while it is incorporated as a theme into a number of initiatives, there were 18 local authorities that were actively trialling alternatives to weed control methods. And then I suppose the next area we looked at related to green roofs. Now, this is an area where because land is being replaced with impermeable surfaces due to population growth and urbanisation, there's a need to consider alternatives. So there's a number of initiatives across 12 local authorities that are looking specifically at green roofing as a solution to that particular issue. And Dunleary providing case study there in relation to their green roof initiative. And then the final subcategory under this topic relates to environmental awards and designations. So local authorities were asked about their involvement in environmental awards and in designations, as these are seen to be the key mechanism through which climate action can be promoted and encouraged. And 28 local authorities reported that they were involved in managing or engaging in this type of activity. And now we move on, I suppose, to the final of the 4 themes, and this relates to services and public engagement. So the majority of local authorities reported taking a leadership role in trying to influence the societal and the behavioural changes that are needed to deal with climate-related issues going forward. Now we also have 4 case studies under this heading. So if we look at the educational first, when reporting on the educational awareness initiatives, 2 specific categories of training and awareness actually emerged when we did the analytics in relation to this. And so we see climate change and waste management being 2 key themes. Now, all local authorities were involved in some elements of this educational training and awareness programs, but the focus, interestingly, was the majority in relation to citizens. The training was focused on citizens, but just behind that is a focus on local authority staff and employees as well. So there's quite an inward and an outward focus. And then the third category relates to people in social housing. So there's a good mix of training and awareness initiatives across a wide range of stakeholders. And in terms of case studies, then Kildare provided a couple of case studies in relation to climate action training that they were undertaking and workshops that they were hosting. And I suppose the final area then relates to community initiatives. Now, there are local authorities have been involved in a variety of community initiatives for many, many years, but increasingly the theme of climate change and climate action is emerging across some of those traditional initiatives as well as new initiatives. So the survey reported that 20 local authorities had said that they had 2,400 allotments between them. 16 reported that there were 97 community gardens in total between them. 20 reported that they were involved in community climate action programs, and 27 involved in green business initiatives. Now, the Tidy Towns, which has been in place for many, many years, has increasingly started introducing new awards and so on, which place increased emphasis on natural heritage and biodiversity, so that there are currently 884 towns and neighbourhoods involved in Tidy Towns that now have some kind of emphasis on issues related to climate action. So in terms of case studies then, there are case studies in from me that in relation to sustainable energy communities and Dublin City and their carbon credits project. Now I realise that was quite a big journey through an awful lot of material there, but I suppose the survey did allow us capture a snapshot of local authority activities across a very wide range of actions, which I wanted to touch on today. But the case studies in the report do provide a profile of the work of the local authorities in quite a lot of detail. If people are interested, the link below there will bring you straight into the report. But the case studies also offered local authorities the chance to learn from each other. So that's, I suppose, retrospectively, but looking forward now, the report does provide a backdrop to a future with way more coordination, target setting and shared learning. And this is really illustrated through a sectoral strategy that local authorities are just concluding at the moment, that outline their commitments under the Climate Action Charter and the Climate Action Plan. And it highlights as well the enhanced role of CAROs going forward, and also the need for local authorities to engage and the benefits to engaging with a whole range of partners, including the energy actions. So just to thank everybody for their patience in I suppose listening to such a long presentation and detailed presentation, and I'd take questions at the end. Thanks very much.